I want to get started right away that somebody wants to know, how did they come up with the number 88, the 1 in 88? For so long we were at 110, then we were at 100, and of course we're referring to the incidence of children on the autism spectrum in the United States. 1 in 88 is the current number that CDC has come out. So where does that come from?
First of all, hi. Happy New Year to all of our viewers too. The number 1 in 88 is actually, when did it come out? About a year ago or something, but it pertains to data, I believe, that goes a couple of years back. So right now, if they were going to measure it, who knows, it could be possibly even higher than that. So by the time we get these numbers out, they're already a few years back. And I believe the numbers are based on states like California, where there is a counting system. In California, obviously, they base it on the numbers from the regional centers or Department of Developmental Disabilities Services. And when you apply to get funding for your child, then that's sort of tagged as a number, and that's how they calculate. And I think most of the data up till now has been based on California, because California is one of the states that does a lot of really good tracking. But the other thing, of course, is that there are some measures of kids in each state, the number of kids in each state, and there are surprisingly certain states that have much higher numbers, like New Jersey. I don't know, there are certain locations that have higher count. The count is obviously faulty in a number of different ways, because not every child gets services from a funding source that's counting these types of things. But if they are faulty, quite honestly, the error is that they're too low. So in other words, it could be a higher prevalence at this point. So we don't know. And
as you said, it's always this delay.
The delay, right. And I can't remember off the top of my head, the 1 in 88 data could be as old as 2010. I mean, it's always 2 or 3 years behind. So
it's shocking.
It is.
But I imagine that the reason why we have these numbers is to kind of gauge the direction in which they're going. That it's not as if the incidences of autism are going down; they're going up.
That's right. Well, I mean, it's for a number of different reasons very, very important to keep track of this. Obviously, if we didn't keep track of this, obviously autism could have potentially been still as noticed or recognized as it was, let's say, 30 years ago when I got started in this field. And back then, I have to tell you, it was such a low prevalence that it was a very tiny disorder, and no funding, no real services, or even any law that would pertain to kids with autism or adults with autism. And the only reason we have, well, there's 2 reasons really that we have so many resources now. One is the fact that we can see it increasing, and the second is I attribute a lot of it to the organization Autism Speaks, because they have taken this type of data and lobbied for help. And that's why we have now insurance coverage and awareness and programs and all these different types of things available. It's not as good in other countries. I know that there are different counts when they've done some epidemiological studies in northern European countries like Norway and so on, and they have similar counts. I think at one point I heard that the UK has a higher number actually. But regardless, most of the world, there's not a good count. Obviously in the Middle East and like Far East and Africa and so on, or South America, we don't have a tracking system. So they're way, way behind in terms of just getting help.
It seems like 1 or 2 years ago that a study came out for Korea, and I don't remember whether it was Northern or Southern Korea, that the number was shocking. It was like 1 in 48. There was a lot of people saying that it wasn't accurate, but it created a lot of...
Absolutely. There was something really wrong with the study. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember reading it and critiquing it, and there was something pretty invalid about the numbers just due to the way they had done the study.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the numbers have been increasing. People often ask me, Shannon, if I think it's just due to improved diagnosis, and there's absolutely no way that it's due to improved diagnosis. A lot of parents are told that the diagnostic criteria changed, and that's why, but that's not the case either. I mean, people don't realize that the DSM-4, which is currently in place, the autism section, the last modification to that was at 1994, and 7 became the training version, but really for a decade or so, almost a decade, we haven't had any kind of change in the diagnostic criteria that would lead to an increased number of kids being diagnosed.
So we've talked about this a little bit before, what do you attribute that increase to?
Right. I mean, for someone like me who's my entire world has been autism for over 30 years, 30 somewhat years, it's really fascinating to watch a disorder just increase this way. It's pretty unbelievable. And trying to keep up with all the research, both medical, epidemiological, psychological, behavioral, whatever, all the research that's out there, you look at it and the only explanation could be, because genetic abnormalities don't develop that fast, so it has to be this combination of a genetic predisposition and environmental factors. And then you look at the environmental factors and you ask yourself, what kind of environmental factor could cause something like this? And really the only answer that I feel very confident in giving is toxins as a whole. And when you look at, of course, we're exposed, all of us are exposed to the same toxins. However, we have different ways of detoxifying, different speed of detoxifying. We have different immune systems, all of us. But when you look at the number of toxins in our environment, and because we are exposed to them and use them all the time, we don't even consider them as toxins. So I'm not even just talking about things like vaccines, which are clearly an intoxicant, but you look at things like plastics, and when we were kids, we didn't have plastics. And now, there's nothing that doesn't come in plastic. And just water bottles, everywhere. And it's all plastic. And plastics, of course, do produce quite a bit of different types of toxic elements. Then there's all the pesticides in our food, which we gradually sort of get used to. But hey, we have very, very little healthy bacteria anymore, exposure to healthy bacteria. We really have pretty toxic water supply, pretty toxic food supply. A very large percentage of the food we eat in the US is genetically modified food. So all of those things contribute. And if you are, in my mind, if you're a child who has a slowed down detox process or redox system, then obviously when you're exposed to these types of things, it's going to affect your brain development.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We went to the ARI conference recently,
that's right.
And I had a conversation with you beforehand where you recommended some specific people that I should go and hear them speak. And it was really wonderful because I've been to ARI conferences before, but I've never had you recommend speakers before.
Specific people are so amazing.
So I have to say that it made it a different experience for me, the talks that I was able to go and hear. And I think, in the future we might ask you for all of our viewers to recommend some things, because just in the things that you were talking about, Dr. Clara Lajonchet was talking about a twin study that showed very clearly, looking at twins, that there has to be some combination of genetics and toxins, because otherwise you would see, it was all very clear in the study. And I went to see Dr. Claudia Miller talk about toxins.
She's amazing on both of those people. I mean, Clara has really good data, and Claudia is amazing in terms of just helping you understand what's in our environment.
And as a mom, you know, I have autoimmune issues that I did not know until my child was being diagnosed with autism. And as I meet moms around the world, I keep hearing from them that they have autoimmune issues too. And she was talking about how those kinds of things go hand in hand, that, you know, if we're immune not efficient for whatever reason, and that our child is diagnosed with autism and they're not immune efficient, and things that you could do to make our immune systems work better and their immune systems work better. It was really fascinating stuff.
It is, absolutely.
But I think in the future, maybe when those kinds of conferences are coming up, we might ask you to say, okay, if you are going...
I would go to these talks. Yeah,
exactly,
sure,
because there were so many things to participate in there. And as I said, I've done it before, but it wasn't as...
I mean, a lot of the speakers are fantastic at ARI. I'm so fascinated, and I think it's just an area that I like to learn more and more about.
Me too.
Which is really just how is the environment affecting us. And I think that's, people don't realize that we're not just talking about autism here, you know, we're talking about a lot of chronic illnesses, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, I mean, all these types of illnesses, as well as we're talking about things like, you know, I think I might have had this conversation with you before as well, like infertility, the number of women right now trying to get pregnant and how difficult it has become. This is, you know, all of our biochemistry, our hormones, everything is affected by what we're taking in.
Absolutely. So. And in general, I mean, I think it's just feeling better.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh.
You know, especially we think about this at the start of the new year. Everybody wants to feel at the absolute best that they can.
Definitely.
And we all should be entitled to that. Okay, moving on to another question here. My son has a difficult time playing with board games and needs so much adult intervention to stay on task. Any recommendations for that when you have to have that adult supervision for playing board games?
I guess without knowing, unfortunately, in a lot of these cases, when I answer appropriately, I don't really know the child. So
absolutely, and thank you for mentioning that. And that's something that I want to remind everybody, that as we're taking in information here from you, there's no way that you could put everything in a sentence that would tell us everything that we need to know. It would be a disservice to your child to think that we could, and we never want to make it seem as though we're giving child-specific information. And you're always very professional about that. But there are a lot of things that you tell us that are general, that are so helpful.
I hope so, because, like, you know, it's so different per child. And when you look at, like, this situation, for instance, I don't know, you know, what I would do is I would step back and, first of all, understand if, like, try to figure out if the child knows the actual steps of the game very well, because if the child doesn't know the steps, in other words, is the adult trying to get the child to attend or trying to get the child to do the steps? And those are two different skills. So I would first try to make sure that the child understands how to play the game step by step on their own, okay? And if we're pretty confident that the child can do that, then you start out with the adult. Essentially, you measure the period of time that the child is able to maintain the game on their own. So what's the child's baseline of it paying attention to this particular game, and you reward that. So if the child is able to, let's say, pay attention for 1 minute, that's great, and you reward that, and you will then increase that time frame, because so the child, the next time you play, you try to get the child to go for 1 minute and 10 seconds, 1 minute and 20 seconds, and that's how you shape it up to playing the duration of the game. You can pretty much use a shaping procedure with reinforcers to kind of, you know, have a child or an individual do anything or expand the period of time of anything. But the issue is, keep in mind for this parent, you know, playing games, board games, is supposed to be fun.
Right.
And if the child is losing their attention to the board game, perhaps it's just you know, playing a board game is a reinforcer within itself.
Right.
So maybe this is not a type of game that your child is really into. I don't know. That's another thing to consider, is that yes, on the one hand, you want to make sure the skills are there.
Right.
You know, make sure the child can attend to things they're interested in, and then, you know, you want to make sure this is something that's up their alley. This is what they want to do.
And I would imagine, because there are so many different reasons. What I remember when they were working with my son and they would play board games, there were at different times they were working on different skills.
Yes, absolutely.
And they were always trying to make it reinforcing, but early on, they were trying to teach him, how to follow rules,
Right.
how to take turns, how to make
the
socially
object of the game?
right,
What's the object
how to make socially relevant comments
Absolutely.
for conversation
That's
during the
right.
game, how to lie,
Yeah.
tell the white lies. There were different things along the way, and
That's
so
right.
my question is, what point are you at right there with the board games?
Right.
What is it that you're trying to work on? And
Exactly.
and as you brought up, if you're just working on attending, maybe that's the thing you focus on,
Right.
but finding something that's reinforcing.
And see, that's the thing, Shannon. It's like most of the time what happens, and that is pretty similar to also what happens with our kids in school when they have a shadow.
Yeah.
We end up, when we have an aide or an adult or someone working with a child, a lot of times what happens is the aide or adult is trying to teach the child almost everything all at once.
Right.
It's like, pay attention, and this is what you're supposed to do, and look, it's your turn now, and say something social to these people, and take your turn, and remember, you want to win, and it's just too many things.
Yeah.
And so the concept really is, the only way you can be successful with this is make sure the child is really fluent on all aspects of the actual game itself.
Yeah.
And then make sure the child is able to do all the things that are required in playing a game.
Yeah.
So, taking turns, understand what their objective is, able to lose or win, all of that sort of
Right,
stuff.
yes.
And then able to attend, because otherwise you will always have the adult prompting continuously.
Well, you just described me parenting. As a former teacher, I understand the concept of teaching somebody something, and you don't try to teach everything all at once. You teach
Right.
one thing at a time. But as a parent, I do that. I want my child to be able to do everything in the moment, and I will pick at him.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
not good. It's not the way. I know it's not the way to teach things, and yet in the moment, I succumb, like so many people, I would imagine. Okay, we have another question here. What kinds of services, if any, are available for adults on the spectrum that are high functioning? I'm not in the California area like you are. I'm on the other side of the country in Cincinnati, Ohio, and it seems as if the only services for autistic adults are limited to those that are severely low functioning. And I would imagine, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this, but we hear this a lot.
Yes.
And that, I think that we're very fortunate in California, but I think that Ohio is not the only place that does not have enough services for high-functioning adults, or adults in general. On the spectrum.
And to be honest, I'm not sure I would be able to recommend something even in California, if you were in California. This is probably the biggest guilt trip I go through, because we don't have, there aren't, throughout the country, there are not enough programs, there are very, very few, that can address the issues of adults, and particularly adults that are high functioning. Here in California, the HELP group is pretty terrific with that. They have several programs for adults and teenagers and, higher level
who
individuals.
else I love here in California is Joey Travolta's inclusion films.
Yes, definitely.
It's brilliant.
Definitely.
And he actually takes it in small workshops and travels around the country.
Absolutely.
So if there's an opportunity for him to be in the Ohio area and you see that,
they're terrific things.
Oh, we just hear amazing things that come out of that.
But the thing is that the problem is, I guess, that adults or adolescents with very high functioning autism or Asperger's or PDD have made it through this far, sort of without a lot of service, and therefore, when they get to a certain age and they start hitting a lot of problems, people don't know what to do, where to go, how to handle it. We have, and I think I might have talked to you about this earlier as well, we have a pretty, I would say over the last couple of years, just maybe 2 or 3 years, and I think that's just because the prevalence of autism started increasing, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And now those kids are hitting us. Sort of the baby boom generation of autism is now coming to us in the form of adolescents and adults as well. And the high functioning adolescents and adults, there's 2 major areas of concern. One is They become depressed and anxious, and that really concerns me, because psychotherapy can help them, obviously, but it has to be done in a very different way. The issues that these adults and adolescents go through have to do more with just not being quite able to fit in, not understanding what's expected of them socially, not being able to cope with all the social demands, those types of things. Very similar to what all teenagers go through, you know, very similar stuff, just a little bit more, because it's harder for them.
Sure.
And the other area is we seriously don't have good training programs for vocational skills, or all of the skills that are necessary for these individuals to actually find a job. Yeah. And then the connection to employment, you know, that sort of thing. So there are people in this world, you know, like yourself, who take their experience of autism and turn it into something positive for others. And one of those people is a gentleman, Lou Vismara, and he was one of the founders, together with another gentleman who I respect very much as well, Rick Rollins, and both of them, they were fathers who were part of a group of forefathers who helped found the Mind Institute up in Northern California. And so those individuals, their kids have now reached adult age. And of course, they are amazing people. And Dr. Vismara, of course, is very involved with the Senate as well in California. And so one of the things that they're pushing for this year, I know Lou is to start developing classrooms for teenage level, or 17, 18, 19, so on, where they learn vocational skills, as well as where we can infuse as much technology as possible to help teach them. Yeah. Because really, I think the vision they have, or Lou has, is to try to use technology to teach adolescents and adults as much as possible all over the country, ultimately. So we're hoping to be able to pilot a program with them in Sacramento, and then to try to develop some programs. This is, I just wrote out my sort of, I think 5 or 6 goals for this year. And the development of our Card 2 program, is what we call it for adults, is one of the priorities this year, because we do have a lot of adults at Card. We do work with them. We do have a developed curriculum for them already. We just haven't gotten it online yet, sort of like skills. And working with high functioning adults and adolescents takes you from a pure behavioral, you're not so much in the realm of pure behavioral anymore, and it's sort of like a mix of ABA and cognitive psychology, and then it really goes into things like job training and so on and so forth. But it's a massive curriculum. I mean, if you think you've seen skills, you know how big that is. Yes. Card 2 curriculum is major as well. And those types of skills are pretty easy to teach. Most of the time with our adults, we have 2 things going on. One is they have never really, if they're more affected, let's say by autism, they've never really learned how to communicate well, or communicate their needs well. So they have behaviors. And people tend to be very afraid of them when they have behaviors, because they're pretty big people now, they're grown-ups. But once you teach them communication skills, all of a sudden you have a whole different thing. You're not dealing with a child anymore. You have an adult who's now all of a sudden open to just receiving, and a lot easier to work with in a million different ways. And then there's 1,000 things, like whether it's an adult at the level where all you want to really teach them is a vocational skill, or it's an adult at the level where you teach them how to cope with college, and how to actually find a job, make a resume, balance their checkbook, all those, access public transport, all of the things, we do all of it. And so, I haven't helped this person because I don't really know very good programs. We do have a list of some of the ones that we consider good. There are some programs in the Northeast, sort of upper New York and Connecticut and so on. So I guess what I would say is, if this if the person who wrote in needs help on this issue, I would suggest you actually send us an email.
Okay.
And then we will correspond with you directly and give you some of our recommendations for your child.
Okay.
Or adult.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I'm excited then for the CARD 2 curriculum.
Yeah, we really want to develop that. I'm going to assign one of our senior supervisors just to that project this year.
Very cool. I was going to take one more question, but why don't we take a short break,
Sure.
and then we'll come back with more of your questions. We're working our way down the list, so keep those questions coming in. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Ask Dr. Doreen. We are here right now with Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh, truly a visionary in the field of autism. Always such a thrill to have you here. And those of you who are watching us live on www.autism-live.com are writing in with a lot of questions. We're loving that. We're going to get through as many of them as we can, and then we keep a list of the ones we don't get through, so don't get discouraged. We will get to them. We had a couple of different questions about diet, and in particular the GFCFSF diet. I'm going to mention, by the way, that a little bit later on today at 11:15 we're debuting another in a series of videos that we're doing about the GFCFSF diet. Today they're doing macaroni and cheese, and it's the most amazing recipe. My son is now addicted to it, so that'll be at 11:15, and that is with the founder of Taka, Lisa Ackerman. She's been doing these videos for us, and she's an amazing cook. But GFCFSF, which stands for gluten-free, casein-free, now soy-free. And somebody wants to know, going to start the GFCFSF diet, what do you recommend I do first? Do you recommend that they do one at a time?
Yeah,
or?
That's pretty easy. Yeah, I think and I'm not sure what exposure the child has to soy. The fourth one, by the way, that most people do is corn.
Yeah.
But what I would do is I would start with casein. I would assume that soy is limited in your child's diet, so that would be an easy one to eliminate. So you might potentially want to get rid of the soy. This is on the case that if it's just soy milk that they're drinking. I'm not sure what their exposure is, because soy could be also providing protein to the child. I don't know. But in this case, if it's just a small exposure currently of soy, then I would get rid of soy and casein at the same time.
Okay.
If it's a very large exposure to soy, and also soy is not very good. If it's a boy, I don't know, you should just get off soy anyway.
Right.
So soy will increase estrogen levels as well. So generally speaking, what I tell people is start with casein, get rid of casein, and that takes about 3 weeks or so to really have the full effect of it. And you'll know, because if your child doesn't change in terms of their energy level or calmness, if you don't see like these rings that I always have, you know,
and me as well.
When you see a child with dark rings, the very first thing is let's get rid of milk.
Okay.
So if you can eliminate the casein, and I'll talk about that momentarily because that's pretty easy. You can replace this with a number of things. First of all, your child really doesn't need milk. Your child needs calcium.
Right.
And so you can replace it if you want with other forms of milk. I mean, like camel milk, if you can find it, coconut milk, even rice milk. And rice milk, of course, then you have to think about things like constipation, or does the child have pretty regular GI tract? If not, then you don't want to go to rice milk. But there are other almond milk. It depends on other allergies and other situations. So you get rid of casein, you wait 3 weeks. If you don't see much of a change, I think the best way to test it is just give your child a glass of milk.
Right. And
After
see what
3
happens.
weeks. Oh yeah, because sometimes I'll tell people that just at an intake, because I'll see like really dark rings or something, they'll go home and stop milk, and about 3 days later they'll call me and say, oh my God, we have a different child. And sometimes it just works instantly, and sometimes you don't see it until you actually give the child another glass of milk or an infraction, and all of a sudden the child's out of control, or just dazed, completely out of it.
Checked out, yeah.
Right, checked
absolutely.
out. So milk is pretty much, or casein as a whole is the first one, and then gluten. Gluten takes a little bit longer to see any kind of thing, and it's not as much of a drastic change in behavior as it is in bowel movement, rashes. Those types of things tend to be affected much more by gluten.
Right.
In general, you know, I always find it kind of interesting because the first genetically modified food in the US was wheat. Long time ago. And that was done just so that we could produce more food for third world countries and so on. And so really eliminating gluten is probably one of the healthiest things we can do for ourselves. I generally never really give my kids milk anyway. I never did. But it's hard to stay away from gluten because pretty much any bread product or, you know, lots of products have gluten. But these days, oh my gosh, I mean, anywhere you go, you even go to a coffee shop and they have gluten-free everything.
It's very exciting.
It's unbelievable. It's just amazing. And it always fascinates me, Shannon, because we go through these cycles in just the world, you know, where we produce things that are destructive, and then we start to produce things that will overcome the destruction we've done to ourselves. Absolutely. So we're doing that again with gluten now. It's funny. But yeah, I really recommend lowering those. You know, and again, not for every child. It's easy to test for if you want to do tests ahead of time, but if you don't, it's easy to see the changes. And when you do casein, and a lot of people are concerned about the whole process of what about calcium? You know, what I did, and it's very easy all over the country, any pharmacy, any just like drugstore, you know, Save-On, whatever, Rite Aid, you go and request liquid calcium and they will order you a bottle of calcium, which is mixed with some orange flavor, which is absolutely delicious. And it's like a spoon of that will give your child 3 times as much calcium as they would get from milk anyway.
Okay, interesting. But again, not necessarily for every child, but for for what I hear from parents is that there's only 3 different reactions when they do GFCF. There are parents who say huge difference in behavior. Parents who say we really didn't see something in behavior, but that, you know, we did it for 6 months to 2 years. Our child was a little bit healthier. Wasn't a big deal. And then there are parents who say, I saw nothing, and after a period of time, we went off of it and went back to our regular diet.
That's right.
That there's no harm, no foul, you know.
Right. I mean, the whole concept, you have to understand how this whole thing actually comes about. Like, why are we doing a GFCF diet, you know? So the original concept comes from the idea that, hey, we have, or some of our kids have what's, I guess in lay terms, called the leaky gut. And where does this come from? So like one of the cycles that it comes from is just, you know, your child is very young, has a lot of ear infections, right? And you go to the pediatrician and the pediatrician gives you antibiotics. Okay. Fair enough. Your child gets better from the ear infections eventually, but sometimes, to be honest, I'm shocked at the number of antibiotics a small child is given. It's better now, but it's still there. So what happens is the bacterial infection that was causing the ear infection, let's say, is gone, but at the same time, all the healthy bacteria is gone as well. We have a lot of bacteria that's necessary in our gut for us to be able to digest food. And so all of that's gone as well. And so when all that's gone, your child is now not really able to digest the food in a way that they can break down the peptide. So when you eat a protein, it breaks down to a peptide, which is kind of a chain of amino acids. And that then further breaks down to amino acids, and those individual amino acids are what then give you nutrition, okay? That doesn't happen completely. The process isn't completed with a lot of children. And if that isn't completed, those chains of amino acids, those peptide chains, tend to go through the blood-brain barrier and have an effect on the child of an endorphin. So they will make the child feel kind of dazed and out of it, and sort of maybe in some cases just giggly, or just not able to concentrate, not able to focus, all of that. And so that, when studies were done very early on, and this was not just autism, but the 2 primary food products where the peptides were difficult to break down were gluten and casein. And that's why the idea came that, hey, we should, and this, I have to really go back and say, for me, the first person that I feel contributed hugely to this was Karen Cerusi, who was a mom and I think Karen is still in Norway. She was amazing.
Yes.
And she did this way back when nobody was even thinking about this. She really, truly changed the field in that sense, and should be credited more, I think, for this. And did this with her own son, and started a diet free of casein and gluten, and wrote about it, and it was a pretty tremendous change. And then scientists started going back and looking and saying, oh, this is what's happening. He's not being exposed to those peptides that are, they're basically leaking, but they're not really leaking. It's just that they're not breaking down, and therefore they're having an endorphin effect.
Yeah.
And so that's where the whole thing started. Later we realized, oh, hey, anything that you are it's not allergic to, but anything that raises your immune response. So could be soy for a lot of kids, could be corn, could be a bunch of other stuff.
Right.
And often I say we take for granted how important it is to identify those things.
Yes.
They make a very, very big difference.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So an interesting thing to try, and again at 11:15 we're going to have a new recipe. I know somebody had written in that they are looking for a casein-free cheese, and the meal that Lisa's going to show us how to prepare a little bit later at 11:15 is macaroni and cheese, and it's really, I have to admit, it's really fabulous.
Amazing.
And I was a huge skeptic. It's fabulous. Even Emily, who I call our Martha Stewart / MacGyver, who is not on a GFCF diet, tasted it and said that's really good.
That's amazing. What does she use? Do you know? What is
it's a rice pasta, but she uses a butternut squash soup that's absolutely amazing on its own. I'm now addicted to it. And there's a new kind of cheese that's out that I believe the correct pronunciation for it is Daya.
Okay.
And it comes in lots. It melts. It needs a little help to melt.
So you mix it with the butternuts.
You mix it with the butternut squash, and it looks like regular macaroni and cheese, and it tastes like it, just a little bit sweeter.
Amazing.
Amazing. It's really tasty, I have to admit. And I was certain that there was not going to be, there are so many things that our family is allergic to and that my son can't have and that I can't have. And I said, I'm sure, when Lisa was describing it to me and said it was heavenly, I said, Lisa, I'm sure we can't have it. I was just absolutely 100% positive. And she said, no, Shannon, you can.
Of course, it's Lisa Heckerman. She
yes.
comes up with these brilliant ideas.
Exactly. And I was 100% sure, and I admit shamed face that, I was just no from the beginning. It's fabulous, and we can have it. It's amazing. It's life-changing, especially if you have kids that you're a GFCFSF with. So we will have that later on. And we're going to get to this a little bit later. Okay, here is this huge open-end question, but what is autism spectrum disorder?
Okay. How much time do I have?
Yes, exactly. How many days can we set aside for that?
I'll try to be very quick on this one. Okay, so autism spectrum disorder is part of the diagnosis is established in a book called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Currently, we're on what's called the DSM-4R revised. I believe the DSM-5 is supposed to come out this year. We'll wait and see what happens with that. The DSM-4 criteria for a diagnosis is there are certain chapters. There's one, a section for children. When you look at childhood disorders, and then there's a section called PDDs, or pervasive developmental disorders. PDDs are disorders that involve more than one area of deficit. So like you might have a child who has anxiety disorder, that would be different because it's one area you're focused on. The PDDs, you're focusing on more than one area, and they include autism, which is actually called autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which is PDD-NOS. There's Rett's disorder, which is actually now being completely taken out because it is a genetic component disorder or identified. And then there was another category that was called disintegrative disorder, which none of us really used. It's a form of autism that's regressive. There's so many children that have regressive autism that there was no point in using the category, so I think it's being removed. So the main three to focus on are autistic disorder, Asperger's, and PDD-NOS. The quick version of what that is you look at it, you evaluate a child, and you look and say, okay, there are deficits or aberrations, differences in 3 areas of functioning: social behavior, communication, and what we call stereotypic repetitive behaviors that have no function. If a child has 2 symptoms in the social behavior areas, deficits. So for instance, they don't socialize with other people appropriately, they don't give, let's say, they don't interact with their peers, they won't come and try to get your attention when it's appropriate, they don't have empathy, those types of social behaviors, those would classify as symptoms in that area. And then the child would have to have 1 in the communication area, so something like they don't have eye contact, they don't have language, they don't know how to talk with their peers, whatever. And then 1 in the area of stereotypical behaviors. So let's say the child is extremely rigid in terms of their routines, they line up their toys, they, repeatedly turn on and off lights, things that don't have much of a function. There's no reason to really do these things, but the child insists on doing them. So that adds up to 4, 2 in social, 1 in communication, 1 in stereotypy. And if you have 2 more in any of those 3, and your total is 6 or more, then you get a diagnosis of autistic disorder. If your total is less than 6, then let's say that you don't have the classic 4. So you have, let's say, 1 in social deficit, 1 communication deficit, and 1 type of stereotypy, or no stereotypies, but and it doesn't add up to the right formula, then your diagnosis is PDD-NOS, which means it's a milder form of autism. And if you don't really have the delay or aberrations in the communication area, so you can speak and communicate with people, but you're socially odd, or have behaviors in the social area, and you do have a little bit of the obsessive types of things, then your diagnosis becomes Asperger's. And that's a very, very simplified version of what the spectrum is. None of it really means all that much, to be honest with you, because it's important for the purpose of diagnosis is important for various things. Of course, we need to focus the intervention, know what types of things work or don't work, get funding. I mean, all of that is based on diagnosis. But more importantly, I think what I always say is forget about the label and focus more on the exact symptoms of the child. What causes the child to do these stereotypical behaviors, which is one of the symptoms. And if you can identify, okay, my child is acting a little OCD or obsessive compulsive, then look at, hey, OCD is one of the anxiety disorders. Maybe he feels anxious. Maybe he feels anxious because he doesn't have language. He can't communicate. Maybe he feels a little bit scared of his environment. Maybe the sensory stimulation in his environment is a little too high, and that's what's causing him to be anxious, and that's what's causing him to put his head down and line objects up all the time. So it's kind of like, if you can understand the process, it's much more important than understanding the diagnosis.
I will say that as a parent early on, I was so overwhelmed by the diagnosis and what did it mean, and trying to figure out what it meant. And I remember in the moment that the doctor said to me autism, that I thought I knew enough to, what the first words that I came out was, I said, well, but it would be Asperger's, right? Because I was thinking, well, that means, higher, which sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. But, those were my first words when she said autism, and she said no. But I guess for me, and I hear this from a lot of parents, I needed to have the classification because I thought that was going to help me to go find what was going to be the answer. And now, further along, it seems to me that what I would have loved in that moment was if she had said, run and go do ABA. It doesn't matter which one of these categories, run and go do ABA, because ABA is going to be effective no matter what.
Well, yes, if you do the right type of ABA.
Okay.
Because, when you talk about ABA in general, of course, is a technique. And that is going to be effective with everyone. Just no matter what the diagnosis is. Whether it's depression, anxiety, suicidal behavior, autism, it doesn't matter. ABA is generally effective. It's incredibly effective. But the content, when you're using these techniques, what you're actually teaching a child with autism is going to be very different from what you're teaching a child with Asperger's. And that, I think, is still something that our field needs to learn a lot more about. Because, generally speaking, board-certified behavior analysts will be doing a lot more basic stuff which doesn't pertain to higher functioning kids. We just, you have had Jonathan on this show a lot of times, I think. Jonathan Tarbox, Dr. Jonathan Tarbox, who's in charge of our research here at CARD. He has really taken a very significant interest in using ABA techniques to teach cognitive skills, executive functioning skills. Several of our PhD level staff have actually really gone into the area of, can we teach executive functioning skills and cognition and so on, and that they've been very successful. And I think that's where we start to mash with cognitive psychology. It's sort of a merging of a behavioral into cognitive behavioral. And that's much more relevant. You would never sit with a Asperger's child, for instance, and say, touch apple. Right. You'd be teaching them things like how to identify inferences. Right. Those types of things. So the content becomes critical. Yeah. And you're right, as a parent, when you hear the label autism, it's just scary. Yeah. It's like, oh my God, autism, isn't that lifelong? I think that's the first thing. Doesn't that mean my child has retardation? All of those things are just not true. None of it is true. So having autism really doesn't mean that your child's always going to have autism. It means that your child has a number of different issues going on right now, and as I've said before, for me it's just like anything else. Break it down to what's my child's biology. Can I stabilize? Can I help my child get all the nutrition he needs, sleep well, not get ill? Can I help adjust some of his sensory needs? That seems to be an area that we need to still develop a lot of. That's another one I should put on my list for this year. And then can we teach him all the things he needs? Yeah. And that's really a very simplistic way of looking at it. But I really keep saying that to parents because you have to overcome the fear of the diagnosis. You have to overcome the fear. You have to maintain hope. Because if you just fear, you're going to freeze, or you're going to go into depression, or a million other things. And the truth is, every single child gets better. How much better? Just you don't know, because the children are so differently impacted by this. But every single child gets better, and it's not as scary as you think in the end. Absolutely. Well, you just made me realize that in that moment that she said autism to me, I had like the chalkboard in my head of what my child's life was going to be like, and we're done. There were all these question marks about, well, which college will he go to, and who will he end up with a lifelong partner, and all these different things, and what will he do for a job. There were all those question marks, but there was no question that he was going to progress. And when she said autism, it was as though that board got wiped clean, shattered, and it was a big question mark about what will happen and will there be any progress. And in that moment, I didn't know that there would be progress. It's unbelievable. And to know, if I'd had the opportunity in that moment to sit down with someone like you, to hear the words, all of these kids will progress. Absolutely. All of our kids progress. But I can't even pretend to imagine, Shannon, like when you were told that your child's, like when everything you envisioned is all of a sudden shattered. How do you suddenly start to rebuild that? I guess it's an interesting thing, because personally, one of the things I go through in life is just learning to trust the universe. Learning to trust where I'm going is where I'm supposed to go. And I think that parents of children with autism are somewhere higher up, because the universe gives you that experience, I suppose, which I call opportunity, sooner. I mean, you really, when your future is all of a sudden non-existent as you imagined it, you really do have to trust the universe. You really have to say, okay, it's not what I thought, but it's going to be fine because this is the best thing for me. This is the best thing. We're going to make this good.
Yep.
And that is just an incredible lesson. That's just an amazing thing.
Well, and we're, in just a few minutes, we'll be joined by Nancy Osbaugh-Jackson. She comes in to do Let's Talk Autism with Shannon and Nancy on Wednesdays with me for the second hour. And she's an amazing person, and she talks about how sometimes these things are an opportunity to grow. And that...
everything. Everything is.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And that when you in the beginning on the first day, you cannot be in that moment. You cannot see it that way, but that after a period of time that something happens and you realize, okay, I have two ways of looking at this and how am I going to do it? And Nancy speaks very eloquently to that. But I do see that I'm far enough along, and I try to share with other parents that that moment does come.
It does
and
come.
that good things can come of this. But I also see now, when we went to Nancy and I went to the LA Autism Walk this year, and it was amazing for us from the generation of 10 years ago of having children diagnosed to now, how different it is. There was a woman who was at the walk who had her 2.5-year-old with her, who had been diagnosed at 2 and who had already started ABA at 2.5. And she was about 4 months in from diagnosis. Child already had a full program and was already making tremendous progress, and she was at her first walk. And Nancy and I hugged her and said, oh my goodness, like you have done what took us years.
You hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she said, it's because people told me. I had the information.
It's because of people like you and Nancy that there are parents who are able to move faster.
I know that's Nancy and I. A lot of our waking time is spent.
Yeah.
I always say here, if I can save you 5 minutes and $5, I did my job today.
Yeah.
And hopefully a lot more than that. But important to get the right information as early as possible.
Absolutely.
And that what you said about hope, that there is so much hope.
Yeah.
I would have loved that on my first day.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we want to take this question about medication? There's do you want to feel that today? Okay. My son is 24 with severe autism, nonverbal. His behavior is really erratic. And he is taking, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation of these, risperidone, Xanax, ER, and Clonidine.
What was the one before Clonidine?
Xanax, but they said Xanax ER.
Yeah.
And still awake most of the night. What else can I do to make him sleep well?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and it's about medicines, and
so I'm cautious when I give my opinion about medication, and this is really just based on my experience, but you really should be, I assume he is under the care of a physician who's prescribed all of these medications. If you are under those medications, I mean, particularly Xanax, of course, and you're still having difficulty sleeping, you can't keep adding Clonidine. I mean, you have so many medications there, and if he's still not sleeping, there has to be something else that's going on that's waking him. I'm not sure. When you say sleep disorders are pretty serious. We're very dysfunctional when we don't sleep, and people don't pay enough attention to that. My suggestion would be, please go to a sleep clinic, first of all. I mean, UCLA has an awesome program. A lot of the universities do, where they will, if you haven't already, where they will do a 24-hour EEG to see what's going on during your adult child's sleep. And this was a
24-year-old.
So you really need to look at those things, because there could be subclinical seizures going on. There's a million other things. The individual could be experiencing pain, GI type pain. Abnormal brain activity of any kind will wake you up and cause that sort of problem. Or it could be behavioral, which of course is a possibility as well. So all of those types of things need to be checked out. I really, I can't say this to you because you have a 24-year-old and on pretty serious doses of medications that are really would knock you out, and he's still not sleeping. But I'm of the mind that if you're not sleeping, there's something wrong. And these types of medications, they kind of function like other, pain medication, let's say. Pain medication, all you're doing is really numbing the symptoms. You're not really fixing what's causing it.
Yeah.
You're just trying to, okay, well, I can't sleep, but let me just put something in there that's going to make me drowsy. And for me, it's a little bit more, why don't you try to figure out what is actually causing it? And perhaps at the age that he is, you already have, and everything I'm saying to you is just very elementary, and I apologize if that's the case, because I find that most of the time with our adults who are still having problems, the parents has just tried a billion things.
Sure.
And that's why I'm saying, that would be your expertise could potentially be beyond mine in that area. But what I do with my younger folks who are not sleeping is really go more into melatonin. And I don't mean just melatonin, because I hate melatonin on its own, but melatonin with tryptophan 5-HTP combination usually tends to work very, very well. Having said that, it's ludicrous to think that you can go from a combination of clonidine and Xanax to melatonin.
Right.
It's such a huge difference in what you're doing. But we do build tolerance to medications, and I don't know how long your son has been on these medications, but if you don't try to do whatever you can to get him off, the dosage will just keep going up, and it'll get to a point where it's just not healthy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So potentially looking to see deeper if there's other things going, because there's got to be other
Sleep
things
clinic,
at some
for
point
sure.
going on. Okay.
Yeah.